All right, we just heard from the Jacob Zuma Foundation that the former president, Jacob Zuma, is laying criminal charge against the lead prosecutor in his criminal trial, advocate Billy Downer. For more on this, we are now joined by legal expert, Mr. Reitumetse Phiri. A very good afternoon to you, sir, and thanks so very much for joining us here on SABC News.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Before we get into the merits of the case and and we sort of analyze what was said this afternoon, I want to talk about an interesting point that was raised by the spokesperson, Mr. Mzwanele Manyi, during that press briefing, which is about the president exercising his rights, and that we have a legal system, and it is right for someone to test that legal system that is available to them. But some people would be saying that this is yet again one of the former president's delay tactics. And I'd like to speak to the issue of, delay tactics versus one exercising one's legal rights.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this particular instance, it's something that we can look at in a very circumscribed manner, which belongs in its own little box and lives on its own. Billy Downer's conduct that the former president is complaining of doesn't necessarily have an impact on the continued progress of the case against the former president, because ultimately the charges that are being or would be preferred against Billy Downer would be ventilated in their own time and in their own separate process that doesn't necessarily spill into or cause any delays with the former president's corruption trial.
And that's a very interesting point you raise there, Mr. Phiri, because, it's as though you anticipated what I wanted to go to next in terms of, how this would then affect the main case. That is and I don't want to belittle the case that they have against the advocate, but how does this then affect the main case against the former president Zuma, in that will advocate Downer still be in, part of this court process against President Jacob Zuma? Does he then have to, and I wonder if this just relates to presiding officers in terms of judges and magistrates, would he then have to recuse himself from being the lead prosecutor of this case? And it seems there is some kind of a reliance on advocate Downer. It seems that he has, over the years, sort of put together a case, and certainly one wonders if, the opposing side would their case crumble, if we'd have to have a situation where the advocate would have to sort of step down or recuse himself whilst having to deal with the criminal case against him by the president, the former president.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the first step in the process that the former president has initiated. We still have to get a determination from the criminal authorities whether they actually will proceed to charge Billy Downer and will proceed to, bring him to a court of law to answer against these allegations under the NPA Act that are put before him. Now, that is a matter of time away. It's certainly not something that'll happen overnight. It doesn't happen like that in this country. And it's certainly something that is most likely to occur after we back in court next week to hear what Judge Pete Koon has to say about the former president's application for Billy Downer to recuse himself or rather get withdrawn or removed from the case, and ultimately for the former president to be acquitted of the corruption charges before him. So I think it is a little bit premature. I think the first step is obviously what happens next week, and what does Pete Koon make of all the submissions that were made to him about a month ago around whether the NPA has the title to prosecute the former president. And if that comes out in the affirmative, in the sense that the judge says, this trial can continue, then we do have a separate process that then must play itself out in the legal process before we ultimately get to a point in time where Billy Downer must actually recuse himself from the matter completely.
Yeah, you talk about the National Prosecuting Act, and there seems to be quite a heavy reliance on the side of the former president on this particular act. They talk about the section that deals with sensitive information, and that what advocate Billy Downer did or allegedly did is punishable by severe sentence. Let's talk about this particular part of the National Prosecuting Act that speaks to that it seems seems the former president's team is relying quite heavily on in order to come after Advocate Downer.
Yes, so section, I think it's 41(6) of the National Prosecuting Act makes it an offense for anybody within the National Prosecuting Authority that's covered by the Act to disclose information that comes to him in the course of performing their duties under the Act, right? Yeah. And the complaint by the former president is quite simple. It's that Advocate Billy Downer was made privy to confidential information of the president. And before that information had actually become public or had become part of the court process, Billy Downer
and get a better line there. We obviously want to continue with this conversation, a very important conversation that we're having at the moment on the back of the Jacob G. Zuma Foundation announcing, of course, that the former President Jacob Zuma is laying criminal charges against the lead prosecutor in his criminal trial. That's Advocate Billy Downer. Apologies there, Reitumetse Phiri. Thank you for staying with us. Just continue then on your train of thought. I actually wanted to, while you're talking about the National Prosecuting Act and which parts of the National Prosecution Act speak to what the former president indeed wants to do, I wanted to ask, if Advocate Billy Downer, let's just say, is found guilty, is found to have breached the NPA Act, and that he indeed, and there's sufficient evidence that he did indeed share private and sensitive information with the media or journalists, is there a possibility on the back of that the former president could then be acquitted basically on a technicality? We've seen that happen before, where a case falls apart, not necessarily because of the main case itself, but because of what happened leading up to the trial, where you basically are acquitted because of a technicality, of something wrong that was done in order to get to that trial. Is that a possibility if Advocate Downer is to be found guilty?
Yeah, well, I think, the former president has actually made his arguments in support of him being acquitted. And part of his arguments actually involved the conduct that he's now complaining of from a criminal perspective, right? So if next week Judge Pete Koon is of the view that Advocate Billy Downer's conduct is not to the extent that it tarnishes the ability of the NPA to prosecute former President Zuma in this corruption trial, then, where this criminal matter ends up in a couple of years or a couple of months from now will actually have no bearing on the matter. It may be that if Advocate Billy Downer is eventually found to be guilty of contravening the NPA Act, maybe he's not the right prosecutor to continue, but the NPA in itself, if Pete Koon finds that next week, would have the title to prosecute the former president, and any other prosecutor that forms part of that prosecution team can then just take over the matter from Billy Downer and become the lead prosecutor, if we can put it in that way.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe it's important to also analyze, how big a crime it is. I mean, it seems, from just listening to what the spokesperson of the Jacob Zuma Foundation was saying, he said, this is punishable by a severe sentence, and it sounds as though, this is a big crime, and maybe we can analyze, how big a crime it really is to leak private and sensitive information, particularly in the position that Advocate Billy Downer is in as the lead prosecutor.
It's certainly serious, Flo, because the legislation creates a punishment of up to 15 years for leaking information contrary to the provisions of the NPA Act, with a fine or alternatively, a fine or imprisonment. So if you just take that period of time and you compare it to other crimes that we have in the country, 15 years is actually indicative of quite a serious crime in this particular country. And obviously, the legislature felt that it is something quite serious for a prosecutor or anybody in the NPA to disclose information contrary to the provisions of the NPA.
All right, Reitumetse Phiri, it was a great pleasure speaking to you. I wish we had more time to analyze this further, but we'll certainly have more time as this case does indeed continue. Thank you, sir, for giving us your time here on SABC News.